For us to welcome you, Madam President Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, to our university. As you know now, because we told you this several times, this building was constructed between 1955 and 1957 based on the plans of architect Jacques Carlu and served as NATO's headquarters during the period 59 to 66 until General de Gaulle decided to withdraw France from the integrated command of NATO. And Université Paris Dauphine only moved there after the events of May 68, which marks its founding. Thus, as the former Assistant Secretary General of NATO and someone who places great value on science and knowledge, I believe it is fair to say that you are, I hope, truly at home here. Your exceptional journey from diplomat to President of Croatia, from researcher to global leader, now serving as a member of the International Olympic Committee and at the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, embodies the values we uphold here at Dauphine: excellence, but also international openness and solidarity, and the ability to combine intellectual rigor with concrete engagements, especially on societal challenges such as gender equality, equal opportunity, and sustainable development. This reminds also us of the crucial role education plays in the world, whether at school or university, at a time when it no longer seems to be a priority in certain countries, and when ease and manipulation tend to prevail over rigor and enlightened debates. As a woman, you also serve as a role model for our young female students here in the room, who are themselves destined to brilliant careers and must never forget that women can aspire to the highest positions and recognitions just as much as men, and in any field. Heartfelt thanks to all of those who made this conference possible. Dauphine Discussion Débat, whose members consistently do outstanding work organizing high-quality events years after years. My office, the International Affairs and the Communication Department of Dauphine, as well as Sophie Marité and obviously Valérie Lozina, who is sitting here, who did a special role in making this event happen. I would also like to take this opportunity to greet our colleagues from the Zagreb School of Economics and Management, with whom we have a student mobility partnership, and in particular Professor Mato Njavro, its dean, who honors us with his participation in our International Advisory Board. I won't be longer. I just wish you an excellent conference, and I try in Croatian. Hvala puno. Okay. Hvala puno.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. At Dauphine Discussion Débat, it is our tradition to introduce our guests before we begin our exchange. Tonight, I have the honor to present a woman whose career has left a lasting mark on her country, Croatia, and on the international stage. Dear Madam, your life is not a quiet life lived in the shadows of history, but one shaped by choices, courage, and leadership. In a Europe marked by crisis, divisions, and hopes for renewals, you stand as a symbol of resilience and vision. You were born in 1968 in Rijeka, in what was then Yugoslavia. Very early, you looked beyond borders. You grew up in the United States before completing degrees in English, Spanish, and international relations at the University of Zagreb. You later deepened your expertise at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, at George Washington University, at Harvard, and at Johns Hopkins. Your academic journey already reflected what your career would embody: a bridge between Croatia and the world. Equipped with this knowledge, you entered diplomacy, and from there, your path became a story of firsts. From 2005 to 2008, you became the first woman to serve as Croatia's Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Integration. In 2008, you were appointed Ambassador of Croatia to the United States. Once again, you were the first woman to represent your country in Washington. And then, in 2011, you broke yet another barrier, becoming the very first Croatian and the first woman to be appointed Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Each of these milestones was not only a personal success, but also a step forward for your country. In 2015, you were elected as the 4th President of Croatia, the first woman and youngest person ever to hold this office. Your presidency unfolded in years of great challenges for Europe, the migration crisis of 2015, growing regional instability, and global security challenges. At home, you had to navigate political divisions, while abroad, you worked to reinforce Croatia's place within the European Union and NATO. During your presidency, you also gave symbolic strength to the Croatian people. The world remembers you at the 2018 World Cup, proudly wearing the Croatian jersey, standing in the rain with the players and with the fans. As the first female head of state in Southeastern Europe, you sent a powerful message to new generation, especially young women, that leadership knows no gender. After the end of your term in 2020, you remain deeply engaged internationally. You continue to speak in global forums, promote youth and education, and advocate for equality of opportunity. Your work has been recognized with multiple awards, honorary doctorates, and decorations, including the Fulbright Lifetime Achievement Award. Madam President, your life tells the story of one word above all: inspiration. It is a privilege for us to have you here at Dauphine. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović.
Good evening, President Bouchard, Madame Mérité, dear students, dear colleagues, Madam Almost Ambassador and colleagues from the Croatian Embassy here in Paris. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be with you here tonight, and thank you so much for this very gracious introduction. I don't think I've ever received such a beautiful introduction as tonight, so thank you. I will certainly remember my visit to Dauphine, not just by meeting with students, and especially the Croatian students here, but by your very gracious words, and hopefully what we do together will make an impact for women and young students, young people everywhere. Thank you again. So tonight, I'm here in my dual capacity, as a matter of fact, as the 4th President of the Republic of Croatia, but also as someone who is practitioner in residence and a special advisor to Dean of the Zagreb School Economics and Management in Zagreb. And I would like to thank Madam Valerie Lozina for being instrumental in establishing our mutual cooperation. My opening remarks will take a little bit longer than what you said, 10 minutes, because I had prepared them before I got the actual program. But I am very much looking forward to our debate and the questions and interaction from the audience. So I have had the privilege to witness world politics up close and personal as President of Croatia, as NATO Assistant Secretary General, who would have loved to have spent some time here in this room as well, and happy to be here tonight. And as someone who has sat right across the table from leaders like Trump, Putin, Xi, and others. And tonight, I want to share with you what I've learned about the world that we live in and the world that we're moving into, and what leadership will require from your generation. In my opening remarks, I will be balancing personal experiences with broader analytical insights structured into 3 clusters: the multipolar world order, personal reflections about relations with leaders, and leadership lessons. So let me start with the story of the July 2018 summit in Brussels, when President Trump, for the first time, I believe, in gradual succession of events, showed what most of the world is aware of today, of his characteristic, and that is predictable unpredictability, and the kind of transactional presidency that he has been leading. So the summit started pretty well on the first day. There was a lot of agreement. There was a wonderful dinner, during which, by the way, Croatia beat England during the World Cup that was mentioned here. And President Macron and myself were rejoicing in the fact that we will be spending some time together in Moscow for the finals in football. However, we come in the next morning and there is a complete change, of course, a complete change of atmosphere. So President Trump comes in the widest possible format, as a matter of fact, of the meeting together with partners and no NATO members. And he started on a very dark note, complaining about the spending or investment into defense by other NATO members other than the United States. And he went actually down the list, country by country. He even referred to Croatia, since we already had a quite established personal relationship. He looked at me, he reads the number, which was wrong, by the way. And he says, oh, you have disappointed me so much. And he goes on, to the point that he says that there is no reason for him to stay here today, and threatening that he was going to walk out. I turned to Justin Trudeau, the former Prime Minister of Canada, who was always seated next to me, as the seating at NATO is in alphabetical order, and I asked him what was going on. And he said, well, now you see what I have to deal with every single day. Apparently, he went to his hotel room last night and he watched some program on Fox TV, which said, what is he doing in Europe, paying billions of dollars for Europe's defense, whereas Europe is paying billions of dollars for Nord Stream 2. And that was, as a matter of fact, the crux of the matter. He said very explicitly, how do you expect me to go back to the United States and tell the American people that yet we will continue to pay billions of dollars for your defense while you're not keeping your obligations of spending 2% of your GDP for defense and security. And I have to say that I did agree with him, because the 2% was something that wasn't imposed by the US, but something that had been agreed to by all the allies at one of the previous summits in Wales. So we were not keeping our obligations, and the trust and reciprocity goes both ways. So from that moment on, again, we realized that he actually is capable of walking out. Everybody gets together, a solution is found in the language that the Secretary General will say that the European partners have really stepped up defense spending, and that he is going back home as a winner. So in the press conference afterwards, he was very happy to say that there is no way that the United States will leave NATO, and that things are normal cooperation and mutual support. So what do we as the European Union learn from that? Instead of really keeping to our end of the bargain, we spend the next 4 years of the Biden administration discussing how we're going to Trump-proof the transatlantic relationship, whereas the only proofing would have been really investing more into our defense and other capabilities as the European Union if we really want to become a global partner. But what are the repercussions of all this for geopolitics today and for the world order, the international system? So I will turn now to the multipolar order and the future of the multipolar world order. In international relations, polarity is a term that refers to how power is distributed among actors of international relations in the international system. So the number of poles, 1, 2, or more than that, has major consequences for international stability, peace, alliance behavior, and order. And the types that are most often discussed are unipolar world order, bipolar, or multipolar. The post-World War II order has moved from bipolar to unipolar to multipolar. So during the Cold War, we had bipolarity. The Cold War was defined by the competition and bipolar system, the US, United States and allies, versus the USSR and the allies. And there was tense stability. But the concept of mutual assured destruction or nuclear destruction ensured relative stability in all of that. And the only wars that we saw were wars through proxies in places like Central America, Africa, or Asia. And the Soviet Union confined its interventions, as a matter of fact, to its own bloc and the areas where, apart from incursion in Afghanistan, where it thought that it belonged to its sphere of influence. In the post-Cold War in the 90s, we see the United States emerging as the only superpower, US dominance, and the so-called unipolar moment. Francis Fukuyama, for instance, declared the end of history and the victory of liberal democracy and liberal international world order. However, of course, that was premature, and the overwhelming question that is now explored by international relations analysts is, has the US really missed its opportunity, its chance to shape the world order during those years? As now, and for a few years now, we have moved to multipolarity or diffusion of power. And here, of course, we have to distinguish between multipolarity in terms of distribution of power and multilateralism as cooperative mechanisms to work on stability and resolving all the issues in the global community. Multipolarity does not require that all poles have equal weight, so there can be different powers with different strengths, either military or political or economic. And as a matter of fact, there is an asymmetry of power today, with not all the powers being equal, and the United States still having that predominance as the most prominent power in the world. There are various theoretical approaches to multipolarity, but what I find interesting today, and what a lot of people, especially in Washington, D.C., are quoting, and we have to know that international relations theories are very much shaped by the geographical region or the ideological region where they come from. So we have mostly Western international relations theories, and we hear a lot less about the theories from China and other places. So what Ian Bremmer says is that we're today in a G0 world. G referring to government multilateral organizations or initiatives such as G7, previously G8, G20, etc. And his G0 world implies not just the shift of power to more than one actor, but also a leadership vacuum. He claims that none of these powers are ready, capable, or they have legitimacy to provide leadership in the world today. He also introduces the concept of the so-called pivot states, which is especially important and interesting for countries like Croatia, because these are flexible, well-connected, small or middle powers that are able to provide good offices and connect different geographical regions and different ideological regions to bridge the differences. One of the examples today is the Gulf states, for instance, Qatar, bridging towards Afghanistan after the fall to the Taliban, or Saudi Arabia bridging towards China and towards Russia in order to resolve some of the humanitarian issues at least. So today the world is in a flux, and we see that diffusion of power to multiple poles: US, China, Russia, India, the European Union, and regional middle powers such as Turkey, Brazil, again, Gulf states, etc. And everything in the world is contested, from resources and supply routes to ideologies, and compounded by the so-called great disruptors, from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine, which require multilateral solutions, and in particular, in the view of the rise of technology and non-state actors that have become quite prominent actors in the international system. So power today is not only military, political, and economic. It really is based on technology, AI, energy, cyber, culture, etc. And all of these can be both positive and malign and are reshaping influence around the world. The interesting fact that is now being debated in many circles is the role of artificial intelligence And the resurgence of artificial general intelligence in about 10 to 20 years, or even less, as experts are saying. And that is the point at which AI has capabilities to rival those of human beings across virtually all cognitive tasks. And the question, will humans actually be able to control it? So in all of these, the importance of multilateral frameworks and rules-based order cannot be emphasized enough in regulating issues such as the AI, but also climate change, health, and many others which know no boundaries or state borders. So the world that we live in, the multipolarity, is thus not inherently stable. As a matter of fact, it's mostly inherently unstable. The alliances are fluid, the values diverge, and there is even fragmentation within the blocs, as we have seen the differences between the US and the European Union emerge, for instance. And in the aspects that I mentioned, such as climate, health, AI, etc., the importance of issue-based coalitions that will go across those ideological borders and that will be realigning traditional blocs will become more important. So let me now give an overview of the US, Russia, China, and the European Union of the positions of the world order and the politics. So a lot of people are now comparing this current period as they're calling it the Cold War 2.0. However, as I mentioned, the Cold War was characterized by stability that was provoked by fear of mutual destruction. And here we have multipolarity that produces instability. And Condoleezza Rice, for instance, has drawn a parallel to the imperialism of the late 19th century and the zero-sum economies of the interwar period. And in my opinion, the whole debate today, it reminds me very much of the old spheres of influence that we have seen in Europe and in the rest of the world. We have seen also the resurgence of territorial conquest, of changing borders, or at least attempts to change borders by force, and in that way tearing up the rule book, the international rule book, going against the main premises of international law, which is state sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. So the United States, during Biden administration, there was insistence on liberal democracy, and the differences in ideology vis-a-vis China and Russia was quite visible. However, Trump comes in. We see insistence on America first, the revival of the Monroe Doctrine, that is the control of the Western Hemisphere, and power defined as the dominant element of international politics. As a matter of fact, President Trump said that he who has the power, who holds the cards, holds the key to the future. So what we are seeing is a shift from a rules-based international order to a power-based international order. And multipolarity without risks, without rules, carries the risk of instability, the risk of fragmentation and rivalry. China is trying to become, of course, a dominant power. They are largely agnostic about the internal composition of other states. So they don't care if they're communist or liberal. They do defend the primacy of the Communist Party for China. However, to them, it doesn't matter what kind of system other countries have. What China is trying to do is assert itself as a predictable and a reliable partner in the international relations, international system, in contrast to the United States, as, for instance, China is now being a lot more cooperative on many issues, and for the first time, they paid their dues to the United Nations on time. It is definitely an artificial intelligence superpower, and it's been building its military-industrial complex. Russia, Putin's manifesto on restoring Russia's power, on restoring economic power, territorial greatness, and standing in the world is now predominantly accepted by most of the Russian political system and most of the public as well. And Putin felt that Russia was humiliated at the hands of the West during the Cold War, so he wants to restore that. And when we look at the war in Ukraine, it has nothing to do with NATO, because NATO enlargement was not in question in 2014, not even in 2020, when they started the open phase of the aggression, but it's that restoration of power, of territorial greatness, and of standing in the world. The EU remains the only rules-based oriented power. Now, strategic autonomy is important because what it means is being able to act with allies whenever possible and whenever we can, but also being able to act on our own whenever that is not possible. The role of the middle power and small states is that even small countries such as Croatia, for instance, which I consider to be a pivot state, punching constantly above its weight, and not only in football, can shape agenda through elements such as energy corridors, mediation, global initiatives, such as the 3 Cs initiative, as an example, that I set up together with President Duda, and that focuses on energy, transportation, and digitalization infrastructure in Central Europe. Now, on some personal reflections on relations with some of the world leaders, I mentioned Donald Trump, and I will go back to the situation when he threatened to walk out of the NAC room. So during the break, I walk up to him, and I tell him, first of all, that he had the wrong number for Croatia, which makes him quite upset, and he calls John Bolton. And then we start the conversation, and little by little, I get him on board for what was truly important for Croatia, the visa waiver program, and the avoidance of double taxation treaty. For the avoidance of double taxation treaty, I refer back to what he said in the NAC, that we're taking too much investment from China. And I tell him, Mr. President, we'd love to take American investment, but I cannot remember the last time the US had a major investment in Croatia. And he goes, and why is that? I said, well, great you ask. As a businessman, would you invest into a country that does not have a avoidance of double taxation treaty with you? And he says, no, of course not. So we don't have a treaty? I said, no, we're the only NATO member who doesn't have that treaty with you. And he goes, why is that? I said, great that you ask. You are saying that your bureaucracy is too big, right? That the government in Washington is too big. And he says, yes, of course. I said, do you know what they're telling us? He goes, what? Well, they're telling us that they don't have the administrative capacity to negotiate an avoidance of double taxation treaty with the country size of Croatia, less than 4 million people. At that moment, he really goes berserk, and he tells John Bolton to do it, and we shortly afterwards start negotiations. The agreement was signed, but it's now stuck in the Senate, so we have to get it moving again. He also came to the 3 Cs Initiative Summit in Warsaw, and he made a special effort to learn to pronounce the name of the island of Krk, which is a Croatian island, not easy to pronounce. He was so proud of himself. Melania probably taught him how to pronounce it. And the reason why he mentioned it was of the LNG terminal that was pending for a very long time before the current government actually put it in place. So what does this show? It shows that personal diplomacy or relational diplomacy can bridge gaps. I established constructive relations with him despite his unpredictability. So sometimes persistence, clarity of message, and framing issues around shared interests can get buy-in even from unconventional partners. Now on Vladimir Putin, with whom I maintained a decent working relationship despite fundamental disagreements, I traveled to Russia to resolve one of the outstanding issues in Croatia on the so-called Agrokor company. Met with Putin, it will be 8 years in a few days, in Sochi, and then with Dmitry Medvedev. And after hours and hours of conversations, we arrived to the solution, and that is getting Russia, again, or Russian companies, Russians bank, around the negotiating table to resolve the issues peacefully rather than suing the Croatian government. So the meetings marked by directness and knowledge of history are exceptionally important, as well as preparations and incremental steps that lead to that encounter. And this is a lesson learned about the value of firmness with respect. Frankness and preparation matter. Knowing the history and psychology of the counterpart can make discussions less confrontational, even when interests diverge, and preparation certainly reduces confrontation. Now, the third, Xi Jinping, the leader of obviously a huge country geographically and by the number of people. When I arrived for the state visit in 2015, it made me feel like I am the president of a country that was comparable in size, in geography, and the number of people to China. And this shows the importance of symbolic gestures in statecraft. And the lesson learned, smaller states can play big roles when strategic. Later, they got very much interested in the 3 Cs initiative as well. So the small states can leverage diplomacy and strategic positioning to punch above their weight in a multipolar order. So what are the leadership lessons for the next generation? First, adaptive leadership matters. We have the need for agility in a world of constant disruption, and the future belongs to those leaders who can adapt to uncertainty and navigate the so-called gray zones rather than rigidly adhering to one worldview. Second, what is important, though, is ethical compass and public trust. Leadership is not only about strategy, but also about trust and moral credibility, and leadership must rest on integrity and service. The younger generations will inherit crises that will require leadership grounded in service rather than ego. And third, diplomacy as relationship building. One of the most invaluable lessons from my own experience, which is even more evident in the development of international relations today, is that formal structures matter, but what often makes the difference is trust and personal chemistry between leaders. So be prepared, know your counterpart, respect cultural context, demonstrate strategic empathy. And what does all that mean for you as the leaders of the future, the leaders of today? Your generation will inherit a fragmented, complex world, but with integrity, adaptability, courage, and strategic empathy, you can be leaders who not only navigate multipolarity, but also shape it into something more stable, into something fairer and safer for all. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to our exchanges.
Madam President, thank you. It's an honor to speak with you today. I'd like to begin by coming back to your early years. You grew up in ex-Yugoslavia, and you were 21, so about the same age as many of us today, when the Berlin Wall fell. How did you experience this transition from communism to capitalism and democracy, and later Croatia's fight for independence? How did this shape you and lead you to entering public service?
Yes, thank you. When I returned from the States in 1987, the situation in Yugoslavia became very complex with high inflation, with Slobodan Milosevic and the greater Serbian idea on the rise. It was obvious that things were leading to unrest. And when I was in the States, one of the classes that I took was European history, because I wanted to see a different angle that was taught in the United States as opposed to the different system that I had been living in. And also law and government, which taught me about individual rights and freedoms and obligations of every individual. And that was a very important, informative period. So I come back to Croatia, or former Yugoslavia, and I was very unhappy with the situation. So I joined the movement for independence of Croatia, and we were determined. That was not our first attempt. there were earlier attempts, just like there was Prague Spring, there was the Croatian Spring as well, which is a little bit less known around the world. So it wasn't the first attempt, but it was finally an attempt where the internal and the external circumstances, because of the fall of the Berlin Wall, were right. And during my history class in the US, the teacher had asked me about a New York Times article which quoted CIA analysis that Yugoslavia would soon fall apart because Croatia and Slovenia were getting increasingly dissatisfied with the economic situation. And she asked me if I thought it was true, and I agreed with her, but I never thought that the breakup would be so bloody and that it would cost so many lives and such huge destruction. So I joined the movement for independence. I started working for the Croatian government, and when the war began, my US family came back to Croatia to persuade me to go back to the United States. I politely refused. I thanked them and I said, if I go, who will stay? I certainly will probably not be fighting on the front lines, but I have to stay and continue to shape the future of my country. So it was an incredibly difficult period, but I would never exchange those years of my life with anybody else because they taught me so many things, including gratitude for the warm bed that you're sleeping that particular night. You soon forget about things like that, but then you're reminded again. And even though working for the Croatian government was for a miserable salary at the time of around 90 German marks, working 24/7, it gave me a sense of purpose, of building institutions and building a new system that we wanted to be modeled on the Western type of style democracy. And right at the beginning, we declared that we wanted to become a member state of NATO and the European Union. As a matter of fact, we believe that had we been a member state of NATO at the time, that we would never have been attacked and occupied. So working through the Croatian government, it shaped me that whole building resilience, which is necessary for what came later in life. But also my US experience was crucial in awakening that desire to really be part of a free society where as an individual you don't hide behind a collective, but you're a person who has the rights and the obligations and that freedom to choose your own future.
After the breakup of Yugoslavia, Croatia, like its neighbors, faced the same immense challenge of building a durable national identity that must strengthen the country within, but also build long-lasting peace with the Balkan countries. How can such a national identity be shaped in a way that supports genuine reconciliation, especially when painful and divisive events, such as Srebrenica or Operation Storm, still weigh heavily on regional memory and relations?
Yes, quite honestly, when I was sitting in bomb cellars or in the the ground floor of my building, and when we were listening to the news from Vukovar, which after 3 months of siege looked like Hiroshima after World War II, it was completely erased to the ground. When we saw so much carnage, so many people killed, mutilated, so many women raped, taken to concentration camps. I thought at the time that there is no way that we're ever going to live again with our Serbian neighbors. But thankfully I was wrong, and why we did it, because we chose future instead of the past. We are still dealing with that past. We're still trying to reconcile with it. And some mistakes were made, such as taking sexual atrocities off the lists in order to provide for that reconciliation. There have to be very difficult compromises that you make. However, today we live where we're lucky to be part of the world that has managed to resolve the wars and open issues taking just years, not decades or even centuries, as in some parts of the world. And that was, again, due to our own determination to do that, to live in peace and to have Croatia as a member state of the EU and NATO. And it was when we realized that the international community is really there to help us, when we work together towards finding the solutions to many open issues. And then started very early on harmonization of legislation and everything else in order to align ourselves with the European Union. We had these goals in mind that carried us forward. And yes, we did achieve all of them, becoming not just a member state of the United Nations in the beginning, but of all of these European integration processes, including of the European Union now, of the Schengen zone, of the Eurozone, a member state of NATO. So goals achieved. Now we have to be more global. And what we're doing is using that experience to assist other regions in need, including in Ukraine, for instance, where we share our experience. And I personally travel often to Ukraine and help them with many of the of things that we just learned and experienced in Croatia. And I think that's the way forward, the commitment by the people and by the government to be able to take those difficult compromises, but also the international community understanding how difficult they are and helping you to take the right measures in order to achieve the solutions that can be as close to justice as possible, because they cannot always fulfill the whole definition of being just and doing justice to people.
But between Serbia and Croatia, there still are quite a bit of tensions every year for the anniversary of Operation Storm, and especially this year, because it was the 30th anniversary and there was a big parade in Zagreb. There's always quite a response by Serbia, which shows that there still is tension today. What can be done differently to have, in some way, a better peace?
What is important, first of all, the military parade in Zagreb was in no way oriented towards Serbia. It was something that all the countries do when they celebrate their national holidays. So it's also to demonstrate your people what you're investing into when it comes to security and defense, that they see that. Second, what really matters is the relations between people. And today you can travel to Serbia, and a lot of Serbs come to Croatia. They work in Croatia. They're a very welcome workforce, especially during the summer months. And they always say, from what I read, the posts on their social media, they're very happy about working in Croatia, the way that they're treated, not just by their bosses, but by the communities, etc. Now, there are rhetorical skirmishes, but that mostly come from President Vučić out of Serbia. He's in a difficult position right now. You have seen that he's got a lot of demonstrations in Serbia, and especially the student protests. And the solution sometimes is to wag the dog, as that movie famously said. When you have trouble in your own country, then you make up an external enemy to whom you point. So one of the accusations was that Croatian intelligence services are organizing those protests. Has nothing to do with, well, it was first a huge compliment to our intelligence services. I don't think they could do something of that magnitude. And they wouldn't want to. Why? Why destabilize our neighbor? We want peace, security, and stability. And if anything, we want to help Serbia become a member state of the European Union. We'd love to see Serbia in NATO as well, but it's their choice right now that they don't want to do that for the reasons of recent history. So I think that these rhetorical exchanges and these elements are being overplayed in the international media because they only make the news, and little things, life as is, actually doesn't make the news. But I assure you that, yes, there are still open issues, that we're still working on finding more than 1,000 missing persons from what we call the homeland war, the issue of archives, etc. But again, people-to-people relationships testify that we do remember the past, but we are much more interested in the future.
Thank you. Now, looking at the wider European context, let's discuss Russia's aggression in Ukraine and recently its increase in military activity near NATO borders in Estonia, Romania, Poland, and potentially near Denmark and France last week. Given your extensive diplomatic career, how far do you realistically think that diplomacy can go in achieving peace? And should the alliance consider stronger military measures if Russia continues its intimidation or focus more on economic pressure?
Yes. What we have seen is this incremental escalation, both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. So President Trump has made, he really thought, first of all, I must say, knowing him, he genuinely wants peace. He is genuinely concerned about people being killed. And he wants that peace, and he thinks that military force has to be there in order to ensure for a country's stability and security, but it should be used very sparingly and targeted only when necessary. That goes a bit contrary to what he's been doing domestically in the United States, using the National Guard in some of the cities, but that's another ballgame. But he's tried, I think he really thought that he could get Putin around the negotiating table, and he didn't realize that he didn't have any leverage. Also, I think that in a way, he was dominated by the Russian disinformation propaganda, saying that this was about NATO enlargement. Because even when Trump obviously promised Putin that he'd get the occupied regions, that it would be neutrality for Ukraine, that there is no chance that Ukraine would be joining NATO, etc., what Putin did was he just kept escalating. And President Trump at one point himself said that he has these discussions, calls with Putin, and then he goes back to his residence at the White House, and he tells Melania, the First Lady, oh, I had another great conversation with Vladimir Putin. And she says, well, and yet again, they bombed another city in Ukraine. So Putin is testing how far he can go with these incursions in the EU space. So these are drones that are capable of carrying lethal equipment, but they were unarmed. So it's testing not just our resolution, what we're going to do, but they're also testing the response time and the way that we respond to that. We made a mistake back in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, when the response was very weak. And I was not at the NAC table, but sitting behind as NATO Assistant Secretary General, and I could not believe that it took us an entire day to agree on a single communique, because there were countries who were blocking language against Russia, saying, what are we going to do if we escalate rhetorically now? Well, Russia only respects force, and they act by force as well. And the escalations in Ukraine have been such, I told you I travel from time to time, and I can feel that escalation, that every time I come, there are more drones, more missiles, more devastation, extending to railways, for instance, even hitting some of the foreign diplomatic missions in Kyiv. And they're now able to penetrate those defenses because of the sheer overwhelming of that. And in the EU, we have to take that seriously. Right now, Russia does not have the capability to attack an EU country, but it doesn't mean that they're not planning to that in the future. Their goal is to wrap up the war in Ukraine. The goal is to take over the whole of Ukraine, and then to reconstitute the force for a potential incursion into an EU member state, maybe not Poland, but perhaps Lithuania, because the Baltics are quite vulnerable. So what is important is for us to demonstrate unity and solidarity, and for everyone to stick behind Article 5, the backbone of the alliance.
Yes, he's testing if we could use this Article 5, you think?
Yes, Article 5, so defense, the collective defense clause, all for one and one for all. He is testing when is that moment when we actually respond back. What I'm afraid of in all this is of a potential mistake that is made. Mistakes always happen. That somebody responds back by shooting down a Russian MiG, or that a Russian drone takes down a civilian, a European civilian aircraft. You see birds taking down aircraft. Why not drones? By mistake again. And that triggers an event, a sequence of events that cannot go back to. So we need to continue to uphold Ukraine's right to self-defense and to choose their own future, and at the same time really and seriously work on our own capabilities and defenses, especially that drone wall that we're talking about, as the warfare in Ukraine. Yes, as the war in Ukraine shows that it's been evolving from a combination of First World War trench warfare, Second World War artillery exchanges, to this very complicated warfare where drones and artificial intelligence are dominating the battlefield, and UAVs are replacing people in many aspects, including taking the wounded out of the battlefield or bringing supplies, as drones are there and they're hitting anyone. So they've become very dangerous, and they're developing very sophisticated mechanisms, or including very primitive mechanisms as well, as literally shooting at drones, but developing drone-on-drone, counter-drone warfare, which will be a huge lesson learned for the European Union, and in that sense we have to cooperate with Ukraine.
The Yugoslav wars were Europe's last major conflict between the Russia-Ukrainian war, and there's quite striking parallels between the two conflicts, from US military support to the landmine issue that you've been quite vocal about. But there's also a lot of similarities in the rhetoric used both by Russia and by Serbia. Russia accuses Ukraine of Nazism, while Vučić has accused Croatia of reviving Ustaša ideology. Based on experience, what lessons do you think Ukraine can draw militarily and in countering these narratives, this rhetoric? What has Croatia done to help Ukraine, and what must Croatia do more, and what must they do in the future?
You're absolutely right. War in Croatia. I'm going to focus on Croatia. I'm not going to talk about the wars in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, because Croatia is where I come from, so I don't want to speak on behalf of the other countries. But it was typical hybrid warfare. So it started just in Ukraine, rebellion of only part of the local Serbian population, but that was supported by the Yugoslav National Army and Slobodan Milošević's regime. They sent them weapons, they sent them people, and they put them under information blockade. And you see that happening. We saw that in 2014 in Ukraine, and then escalating into an open aggression, which happened in Croatia as well with the Yugoslav National Army. For instance, the Battle of Vukovar that I mentioned, for 3 months, a handful of the people, of the defenders, carrying rifles and having Molotov cocktails, resisting an army that had aircraft, cannons, all the equipment. And that's what Ukrainians were doing in the beginning as well. They only had javelins and Bayraktar drones to be able to counter the Russians, and Eastern technology, the same as Russia. They also, what happened in Croatia is that you were trained by that army, so you know the tactics and the strategy, and it's a bit easier to fight that. However, again, it was a bloodbath, in many ways similar, and in the international arena, this constant disinformation about Nazism and dealing with Nazis. The Croatian people were vilified for decades and decades as genocidal people, and if they have their say, they're going to kill all the Serbs and the Jewish people and Roma and everybody else, and that is what Russia is doing to Ukraine. And I actually see it resound. I was in Saudi Arabia last week, and I just could not believe how they were repeating these arguments that are served by the Russian propaganda. They're very, very skillful at that. So obviously Serbia is now Russia. However, we also had a lot to do in order to counter that propaganda, and that includes, with the legislation in Croatia, building the best possible, the top-notch legally legislation for the protection of minorities, for their participation, not just in local, but in the central government. They're always now in the coalition, in the parliament, etc. And the lessons learned for Croatia, of course, we're sharing with Ukraine, from humanitarian demining to war veterans. One of the horrible things that happen to you is that you have transgenerational trauma. So PTSD that is conveyed from grandfathers and grandparents and parents onto children who never experienced the war, but they experience classic symptoms of PTSD. It happens years after the war, and the Ukrainian society the whole of society, because you have that dividing line. However, the whole of Ukraine is being hit by drones and missiles. It's under constant terror now. People have been under constant terror for 3.5 years. So how to deal with that trauma? International criminal justice as well, and how to organize that at home. It's very painful to admit that some of your troops, some of your guys may have committed crimes, war crimes. But you have to be capable of dealing with that and bringing people to justice, and then let the courts decide through a process that we were building again together with the international community. That's what we're assisting Ukraine with today as well. And of course, there is the whole dimension of military and the intelligence sharing aspects. They are particularly interested in Operation Storm, which was a very clean operation. It lasted for 3 days. However, what happened after Operation Storm, we're not very proud of, because the police did not move into the areas to be able to protect the people who remained there and to protect the areas from looting quickly enough. How to be able to not just take the territory back, but how to build the stability and how to properly reintegrate the territory. If you take a territory by force, that you don't have the local people on your side who want to share the responsibility for government, for stability, then you have constant instability, terrorism, and fighting, etc. So these lessons learned from the reconciliation process, I think, will be incredibly valuable for Ukrainians.
We've also seen Russia interfere quite a bit in European elections and in spreading ideology. In Croatia, President Milanović has faced accusations of amplifying Russian propaganda in the country. You know him quite well. He was your first prime minister, even though he's not from the same party as you, and he was the person you ran against for presidency. Do you believe his positions reflect genuine ties with Moscow? And how serious of a threat do you think this kind of pro-Russian discourse poses for Croatia and, on a wider scale, for the European Union and Ukraine?
I'm sorry, but I refrain always from commenting on my successor. He's the president of Croatia right now, so I will not comment on that. Thank you.
No problem. Could Russia's aggression push Europe towards forming a fully unified bloc in response? Do you see the European Union's enlargement to the Western Balkans as particularly urgent and realistic since the conflict in Ukraine? For elements of context, Croatia was the last country to enter the European Union in 2013, and they adopted the euro and joined the Schengen area in 2023 and 24. And as of today, Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia are official candidates but have not yet joined the Union.
Yes. Just to your question, I just want to say that Croatia absolutely supports Ukraine and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the Croatian people do, and the Croatian government provides so much assistance, not military assistance, but other types of assistance to Ukraine. And the position there is very clear. Now, on the enlargement, or on the European Union first, I think that all of these crises, including COVID, the great disruptors, and the war in Ukraine, have actually served as a catalyst for greater European unity, for finding ways how to really become a global power, how to become a force for good in international relations. I mentioned that the EU is now the only, it's not a state obviously, but the only alliance or only organization which relies on only great power in the world, that relies on a rules-based system in politics, in trade, and elsewhere equally. And I think this is where the EU can really project its strength vis-a-vis the rest of the international community and with respect to China as well. It has also served as a catalyst, the war in Ukraine, to finally realize, you know, I mentioned we didn't learn from from Trump 1.0, and it took not just Trump 2.0, but Putin as well, to finally make the European Union to invest, to start thinking of our defense and security as something that we shouldn't take for granted and that we should be able to protect on our own. So to build the appropriate capabilities and to build the European industrial military defense base. I know that people look at it as spending, but it's actually investing. It's like paying for insurance, for health insurance. You hope you're not going to need it, but you have to have it if something happens to you. And the same is with investment into defense. And besides, by investing into the industrial military complex, you're helping the industrial base in the European Union, and also most of these applications go into the civilian sector. Most of them are dual use, and they become part of search and rescue, but also medical assistance, etc. Now, on the enlargement of the EU, unfortunately, I don't see much optimism there. We really are trying to get the Western Balkans into the European Union. I think Croatia and Slovenia, but Croatia in particular is the most adamant supporter of our neighbors as becoming member states of the EU, because for us it means peace, stability, and a joint forum where we can discuss issues before they become problems. So we really want them in there. And we've been pushing for that. I was overjoyed when Ukraine was given candidature status, etc., but at the same time, Bosnia and Herzegovina was not. It later received it, and it was disappointing because it was sending the wrong message to the countries in the Western Balkans. And the message should be, your progress will be measured by your formal steps into the full membership of the European Union. And yes, nothing happened since 2013. On the other hand, I do support Ukraine's membership of the EU, but I don't think that telling Ukrainians that that is going to happen quickly is helpful, because I think we're giving them false hope. I was someone who led Croatia's accession negotiation process in the beginning. It's very complex work. And once you're done with it, and once you're done with all the harmonization and putting into practice of the institutions and everything, there remains the ratification. So can you imagine that a ratification of Ukrainian accession will pass in France, for instance, before we see an end of war in Ukraine? Because then you internalize the war, you become party to that war. I don't think it's going to happen that quickly. Even we, as a relatively small country, had to push very hard for certain countries to ratify. So I think we have to be a lot more realistic with Ukraine and continue to work with Ukraine on fulfilling the criteria and getting the society ready, but not make any rash promises that we won't be able to keep.
Is it because of also economic, maybe, problems that arise with this enlargement?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, you see that in connection with Turkey. Turkey, it's not just that it's a country that has a different system. It's also because it's a huge country to absorb. And that will be a concern because Ukraine will require a lot of assistance. And you see the new Ukraine recovery facility that is being backed by most likely the Russian sovereign fund. But it's going to take a lot of investment to bring the country to the level that it once was, and let alone to a country that can become a fully fledged member of the European Union that is really at the same level with other countries, comparable
there
countries.
Would be budgetary pressures for the EU, but for the countries themselves that would want to enter the EU, are there problems such as, for example, brain drain? Has Croatia experienced
yes.
problems with this recent
Yes, of course.
accession?
Yeah, well, Ukraine is experiencing that because of war, and now the fact that most people, apart from men of now 25 and older, can travel and can ask for temporary protection anywhere in the European Union. So a number of them are using that opportunity to study or work abroad. But a lot of them have gone back home to Ukraine. And what I must tell you is that I really admire their resilience when young people who are constantly under attack, And these attacks happen in Kyiv, for instance, from around 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, completely exhaust you physically and psychologically, but they're still telling me, no, I want to stay here in Ukraine. I want to live in Ukraine. Please help us. Find a way, give us security guarantees, help us to become, they still want to be member state of NATO and of course of the European Union. So yes, but that would mean for many countries what we don't want to see, and that is, for instance, cohesion funding. There are still inequalities and differences within the European Union. You can see that as you travel around. So some regions of the EU, not just the post-Fifth Enlargement cycle, the post-Cold War, but in some other areas as well, rural and isolated areas where you need to invest more into cohesion, into agriculture, into all of those, digitalization, for instance, in order to be able to provide for young people to stay. And for Croatia, the fact that young people, the freedom of movement of people is both a blessing and a curse. I want for our kids to have the opportunities that I did not have under former Yugoslavia. I want them to study and work abroad, but I also want them to come back enriched with that experience and reinvested in Croatia at some point. But the return has started little by little, but it's still not up to the degree that we would want it. We still have to do a lot of homework ourselves in order to create the conditions that young people want to see in Croatia that would really encourage them to come back.
Just to come back to the US that you've mentioned quite a bit in your introduction, America has been a symbol of individual rights throughout their history. But since Trump's presidency, we've seen quite a significant shift in American politics with the new obsession of anti-wokeism, but also this authoritarian turn with ICE, for example. Does Trump's America still resemble what Europe once admired? And should strategic autonomy for Europe be the new priority in diplomatic relations between the EU and America?
That's a really good question. Is it still the same America that when I was there, that I admired so much? The United States has changed, certainly, and somebody recently asked me in Washington, D.C., do you think it's going to affect the European Union? Do you think that the EU will start suffering from democracy deficit and liberalism, liberal ideology, not in the sense of the political spectrum, but of values, declining? I don't think so. I think we're going to hang in there. We've learned our lessons in the hard way, but you see certainly decoupling between the US and the EU, and one of the results is that the EU really wants to become self-sufficient. So I think that strategic autonomy is still there, that it's achievable. It's not just in the military sector as most people perceive it, and it doesn't mean breaking the transatlantic alliance. On the contrary, the Europe wants to see, in spite of everything that has been happening, the tariffs, the trade war, etc., you still don't see that any European leaders are becoming anti-Trump or that they want to disassociate any of the countries from the United States. No, we want to be there. We want to continue the cooperation and the transatlantic link. But we're very much aware that we have to build that strategic autonomy, which means responding to any situation, any crisis, be it COVID, be it war, be it another health emergency, extreme weather, or anything, to rely on our own capabilities, including in cyberspace, hopefully in space one day as well, in the disinformation domain and other areas where the modern warfare and the hybrid warfare has been spreading.
Should America shift, well, should Europe shift their way of approaching America depending on their domestic affairs, or should European leaders just ignore what is happening and keep that same relationship with Trump in America?
Well, the situation in the US is the choice of the American people.
Yes.
They are the ones who have to decide that. So, and it's their election choice, or it's the debate that's been ongoing in the United States. I'm saddened by the polarization that I see. You literally see camps shifting, But I do believe in the checks and balances and the inherent stability in the American system that no one party or one person can take over, that they will be able to move in the right direction. I mean, with, you mentioned wokeism, you know, the pendulum shifting left and right, and I wasn't very happy about gender equality being taken off the table and overshadowed by wokeism, for instance. I think that it shifted focus from women as half of our society, and the fact that we are still not just the underrepresented portion of the society, but we're still a minority, and that suddenly disappeared. So I would like to see that, the comeback of that kind of debate with respect to every single minority. But we're talking now about half of the society, half of the talent, half of the economic potential, half of our people.
Well, you made the perfect transition for my last question on women's rights and this setback with these anti-woke movements. You were the first female president of Croatia, first Assistant Secretary General of NATO, and later you chaired the Council for Women Leaders. Yet in an interview in 2015, you claimed you did not consider yourself a feminist. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to know your definition of feminism. Has it evolved? And more generally, how do you think we can improve gender equality in global leadership?
Well, feminism obviously is the fight for women's rights. But why did I say that? First of all, I don't like to label myself as anything. If anything, I'm an equalitarian, not egalitarian, but equalitarian. So equality for all. And ultimately, I do not believe that women should be singled out and treating in any way any different. I know that, for instance, quota are necessary in societies like Afghanistan. But in our societies, I'm very much against quota because I think they're counterproductive. Again, they single out women and not talented individuals based on their education, merit, ethical work standards, and everything else. And by creating quota, you just fill in that quota and you make women basically compete with each other in order to fill in the jobs. And then the quota is discussed and the percentage of women, etc., instead of finally talking about individuals who are best qualified for a certain job or a certain political position or who can be elected as presidents, prime ministers, etc. Again, no definitions. That was my reaction. That's number one. Number two, in some of the countries, Croatia included, feminism unfortunately has been hijacked and misused as political platforms. So in my own country, some of the people who criticized me most for being a woman and focusing on me more as a woman rather than criticizing my policies were declared feminists. When I continued to breastfeed my baby, when I was elected Minister of European Integration, and I said there is no way I'm going to, and that was based not on some old-fashioned thinking, but on modern research, what breastfeeding means both for the baby and the mother. And I did it in public as well. I did it in the European Parliament. The worst attacks were by feminists saying, you should either stay home with the baby or stop breastfeeding. So what kind of message is that? So that, my instinctive reaction, was in part due to that hijacking of the feminist platform, that only women of certain political orientation deserve protection by other women.
Thank you. We're going to pass on to the questions of the public, if some of you... Sorry.
Your new role for the Olympic Games. You seemed especially enthusiastic during football cups. Croatia has achieved remarkable success in recent international competitions. Do you see sport as a key element in shaping national identity, fostering patriotism, and strengthening Croatia's soft power abroad?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But I always say around the world that Croatia has many talents, not just football stars, but talents in many other areas, in academia, research, so many inventions coming from Croatia or Croatian people around the world. It's not just a beautiful country, but a really for Croatia to be one of the best countries to live in the whole world. Well, at least there is one person that I managed to convince of that, and that is my own son, who is, by the way, an American citizen as well, but he's been living in Croatia ever since 7th grade because we moved around, but we went back to Croatia. And he tells me when I tell him, well, you know, Luca, why don't you go and work abroad a little bit and come back? No, Mom, Croatia is the best country to live in. So there we go.
So now we're going to go to the questions of the public. If you have a question, raise your hand.
Yeah, I had many questions. Thank you for being here, first of all. I had many questions on sports, but it's been covered. So I'll try to be a little bit more political. I think there's a comment you made, which I think I'm sort of questioning myself about, is the check and balances of the US. And you feel very strongly about it. It's still there. And I must say that I'm doubting it right now. So is there anything else you can say to reassure me on that front?
Oh, I know. It's because of all the news. Yes, President Trump, one of the things that he wants is to have complete control of the system in the United States. And one of the reasons why he feels close to President Putin, or why he admires him, is that Putin managed to do that in Russia. So Putin is the product of the system, but he's also he's been working on building that system. And that system does not have checks and balances, but it's a very hierarchical one. Second, they share also dislike of the European Union, and they don't want for the EU to become a major power. And then there are some other aspects, some elements that they share together. So President Trump had 4 years during which he felt what he thought was great injustice of the re-election being stolen. And we knew he was going to come back with a vengeance, both nationally and internationally. But he also came prepared, lawyered up. So for many of the decisions that he makes, you see that people appeal to courts, and then again, he lawyered up, he manages to defend something in the courts, etc. And also, you're probably referring to the meeting the other day with the military commanders, when he justified the force, the National Guard in the streets of some of the cities in the United States, and using the military against the population under the pretext or explanation that because of the criminal activities, the instability, unsafety for the citizens, the National Guard has to protect the people. So yes, those are worrisome trends, but still, as somebody who, you know, going back to the 80s in my law and government class, and wonderful Mrs. Williams, who was so detailed in explaining the checks and balances, I still believe them. And I still believe that the American military, at least most of them, will remain neutral, and that they will protect the country, and that they will protect any kind of situation of any individual or any political party taking over the system. What worries me is the stability of the society itself in crisis. We've seen that in Katrina. A comparable situation in Croatia during war, when we were under attacks, there was practically no crime. You would take neighbors or anybody from the streets into your own cellar. Sometimes people were under attack for weeks or months. They would keep those people who were strangers beforehand in their own cellars. They would feed them. They would share the food, the clothing, everything they had. We all worked together. We all felt solidarity. And during Katrina, the drive to go looting and kill other people was something that I could not understand, and that symbolized failure of the social order of society and of the basic values of solidarity of human beings and helping each other in a potential emergency situation. So that worries me a little bit, I have to say.
Hello, Madam President. Thank you for your intervention. You talked a lot about the military complex a few minutes ago. We know that Croatia bought Rafale in 2021, but there are a lot of countries that still buy American weaponry systems and largely by Americans. Do you feel that the European Union should incentivize the buy of European-made armaments, or do you still think that we use free markets and the normal buy way to complete those armaments orders?
Yes. Interestingly enough, when I mentioned when President Trump wanted to walk out of the NAC of NATO, and when he criticized everyone, he did say, I do understand these countries who were in transition, Eastern European countries who have to acquire new equipment and who are just building their economies, but I cannot understand the rich countries. That's what he said, almost literally. So Croatia had to transition from Eastern-made to Western-made. And obviously we didn't have much money to do that because we had to invest in rebuilding Croatia, in demining, in building institutions, in the Euro-Atlantic accession process, etc. So we would take whatever was available, and it was mostly American equipment. For a while, the United States, through different aid programs, would transfer. It was mostly not new. It was used American equipment, but it would be transferred to Croatia. But the acquisition of aircraft, of fixed-wing aircraft, supersonic fighters, is a strategic decision. So Croatia decided to go with the new Rafale aircraft. And it is aligning within the EU. What's exceptionally important is interoperability, so that our air forces across Europe can work together across the alliance, which was not always visible in the intervention over Libya, for instance. Lots of problems with refueling, ordnance, etc. And we have F-16s, F-35s, the Eurofighter, Rafale, Mirage, and other aircraft in the EU, so quite a variety. But with the new programs that the Commission is putting into place, such as Rearm Europe and Safe Facility Europe, there will be a lot more investment into European military production. However, the United States will continue to press the European Union to buy American equipment as well. And I think that there will be a balance there. I'm just hoping to see that we invest into talent in the European Union, in the young people and the brilliant startups that I see everywhere with great ideas, not on technology, as I will repeat again, that does not have to be applied necessarily under military circumstances, but just to keep security and to work in emergency situations, be it climate, be it forest fires, wildfires, medicine, etc. So I think that we will still be balancing, and some of the equipment from the United States will be very difficult to replace, such as Patriot batteries, Patriot systems. Intelligence sharing is still an area where I see a lot more cooperation, and the nuclear deterrent. Yes, France and the UK possess the weapons, but Russia and China combined will soon surpass even the American nuclear arsenal. However, when it comes to nuclear, it cannot be won. A potential war should never be fought. And I don't think that's even an issue of the number of nuclear weapons. Yes, it serves as a deterrent, but one nuclear weapon is enough to do so much destruction in the world that we basically destroy the whole planet.
Good afternoon, Madam President. I really appreciate your presentation and your message for young generation when you introduced yourself earlier. I just have one question because as a former diplomat, or you're still a diplomat, how would you rate the place of diplomacy in our world today regarding the rise of wars, of military forces? How would you, and what would you tell the younger generations, those who want to become a diplomat after? Do we have a place in this world where everything is becoming more violent physically and military? Thank you.
Yes, opportunities for diplomatic solutions and diplomatic interventions are fewer and fewer, but they have not disappeared. They should never be discarded. Bridges should never be burned. Doors should never be shut in the way that they cannot be open again. So diplomacy will always be there. It just has to adapt, not just to the military situation and the current warfare, but it also has to adapt to new technologies, especially artificial intelligence, and the prospects that I just mentioned, that debate is becoming on artificial general intelligence, that's becoming now, that's taking over the Washington circles. What do we do about that? Will be, if we don't get together right now between the United States, China, the European Union, and regulate artificial intelligence, is it all going to get out of our hands? And even President Trump, during his 55-minute speech in New York before the UN General Assembly, proposed a new initiative on combating bioweapons through artificial intelligence, which would include the United Nations, so cooperation through the United Nations. So right now, multilateral institutions have really been replaced mostly by personal diplomacy and relational diplomacy, but it doesn't mean that they should lose their value. We have to continue to reform them, to adapt them to the new geographical, geopolitical, and technology circumstances. And we have to continue to adapt diplomacy and diplomatic efforts, because the biggest breakthroughs are always made through diplomacy.
We have reached our time limit, so thank you very much for coming, Madam President, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I wish you all a lot of success in your studies and in your careers and all the personal best. Thank you. Yes, of course. Yeah, let me just put...
Čestitam, dobro večer.
Dobro večer. Drago mi je da ste došli. Da.
Jel imate vi s njima neki deal, planovi, nešto sad ili?
Ja mislim da, ne znam, Višnja zna, mislim da ništa posebno. Sad par fotografija, pa onda...
Dok idete za neku kavu, večeru, nešto ili...
Pa može da popijemo nešto. Nisam baš nešto gladna, ali možemo popiti nešto, se malo opustim, jer sam... Jučer sam spavala, danas sam kona špana na...
Ja ću onda s vama u auto, pa idemo tu u jedan blizu restorančić malo sjesti, može?
Može, važi. Evo, ja ću samo... Sorry, I just...
Evo samo da vas pozdravi ekipa iz veleposlanstva ovdje.
Hvala što ste došli. I need to rehydrate myself and then...